Aped by Dark Prince 10. The Lord Admiral preened his furred mandibles as he stepped aboard the human shuttlecraft. "My thanks again for taking the time to come see the fruits of our labors," said his host, a diplomat by the name of Mackenzie. Also accompanying them was another human, an engineer and shipwright who apparently only responded to the name of Alf. The Lord Admiral nodded graciously, gesturing out the window. "It is good to work with such a creative and insightful species as your own," he said, glancing around the interior of the shuttlecraft and noticing more than a few design elements which were modeled after or directly copied from the ships his species had gifted humanity. They had first made contact with humans only a few light years out of the human's own system, well before they had reached the galactic core and the multitude of civilizations therein. It meant they were able to get an early lead on building an alliance with the upstart newcomers, and it was a relationship that was proving time and again to be valuable, if a little bit tricky to balance diplomatically. The human noticed his gaze around the shuttlecraft, and with a smile they said, "We appreciate and thank you again for your generous gift to us so early in our steps out into a wider galaxy. While we had figured out how to generate a hyperspace vortex, the calculations and stability were very uncertain even at the best of times." The Lord Admiral chuckled. "Is anything involving hyperspace ever reliable?" Mackenzie smiled and shrugged. "I suppose that's true. But it took us from a coin flip of whether a ship would survive through a journey intact to simply being a favorable die roll, an improvement we will gladly celebrate." The ambassador went on to gesture towards some of the gilded crenellations running along one side of the seating bench on the shuttle, one that looked distinctly familiar to the Lord Admiral's compound eyes. There were also, of course, a few aesthetic elements that we quite appreciated as well, and hope you don't mind that we incorporated. The Lord Admiral chuckled, a carefully learned cheerful expression he had practiced for just such an occasion. "No, indeed, for is that not the goal of a cultural exchange in the first place?" The human nodded sagely before gesturing out the window as they came around to the first bay in the large ring-like shipyard. The Lord Admiral recognized the ship, or at least thought he did, but something was off. It was a few-dried destroyer, a very sleek and angular craft with the ugly muzzle of a railgun sticking out the front. They were effectively a ship built around the enormous cannon, serving as a long-range fire support when the response could afford to be slower than the speed of light offered by traditional banks of laser weaponry. This ship, however, was missing some elements that he had often seen on few-dried craft, embellishments here and there, but also, critically, the large domed temple that was typically built into the rear of the ship was also absent. He said as much to the pair of humans, and the engineer spoke up. "Well, you're actually not looking at a true few-dried craft, but rather our take on it. We optimized quite a bit of the internal systems, reverse-engineered the railgun mechanism, and found a number of inefficient pathways and power cycling amplifiers that were likely legacy elements. The few-dried are very traditional, so it's likely they never changed the design, unless absolutely necessary. But when you look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, there's a lot of fat available to trim and lines you can straighten on the functional pathway diagram of such a craft. Plus, no temple because there aren't many humans who observe few-dried religious practices, even in this day and age." The Lord Admiral nodded, making a mental note to ask for a small flotilla of these craft, as long-range, heavy support had always been a shortcoming in his culture's armadas. The next ship they came to see was itself, a flat, almost disc-like shape with a large opening in the center. As the Lord Admiral squinted at it, it shimmered and seemed to vibrate even within its berth, and there was a sputtered flash of brilliant neon blue and crackle of electricity visible across the one set of panels on the exterior of it. Almost immediately, a swarm of humans began crawling over it, fixing the surge as the Lord Admiral recognized the design. "I would say that this is a Nanette research probe, except I see no sign of a cockpit, and the whole thing appears to barely be able to contain whatever you're using to power it." The engineer beamed. "Yep, right on the money. Nanette are huge compared to humans, so they had to have a separate orbital cockpit. But because of our diminutive stature, we're able to just smack one on in the back," he said, pointing to a noticeable bulging lump near the back part of the ring structure. "As for the vibrations," Mackenzie said smoothly, "those are being taken care of as we speak. We had some tricky bits when analyzing and reverse engineering the Nanette power core structure, But once we figured out how they layered their fuel cells and output arrays, we were able to almost entirely eliminate feedback and uncontrolled surges. On top of that, said the engineer, there's enough excess power to feed a stealth generator. It's a bit power-hungry, so nothing more than running lights, life support, and minimal ion engines while it's on. But sometimes that's all you need to get out of a sticky situation. The Lord Admiral again nodded with approval, although even with their reassurances, he was less eager to request these be added to his home fleets. He had always been a fan of reliability, and almost entirely controlled surges were not the same as no surges at all. They advanced to the next bay as the alien commander looked on, and for the first time he could see a slight hesitation in the expressions of the two humans. Their confidence reduced a notable degree. He squinted through the screen at the lumpy and misshapen form within. It was massive and alive, whatever it was, and it wasn't until he could see a pair of enormous fan-like antennae gently floating in the near vacuum that he recognized it. By the 7 rings, is that a colony bioship? He turned to them, both amazed by the achievement and thoroughly off-put by how disheveled and abhorrent the ship appeared. Well, that is our attempt to reverse engineer and grow a colony bioship, said Mackenzie. We sought to streamline the growth process to see if we can speed it up from the decades that normally takes to mature such a ship to just a year or 2. We've had great success with accelerating the growth of Earth organic structures, so we thought the same principle might be able to be applied here. Alf chuckled from behind them. I warned them I had a black thumb whenever I tried to grow shit, he said. Oh, it's ugly, that's for sure, but that there only took us 6 months to grow, and more importantly, the part we were most interested in developed perfectly and fully, even if the rest of it looks like it fell out of the ugly tree and hit damn near every branch on the way down. The Lord Admiral cocked his head. There are plants on your planet that can change appearances? Is it some kind of venom or virus that is passed along? Mackenzie quickly shook their head and waved their hands dismissively. No, just a human expression. They turned to the ship, still slowly and lethargically pulsing with life as the brilliant antenna caught the light again. But what Alf says is true. The sensory nodes and organs are, as far as we can tell, fully developed and functional. We're still working out a few nuances of getting them to interface with inorganic computing and control systems. But overall, we've made great strides, even if the idea growing their own ships from scratch has had— They looked again to the misshapen and hideous form filling the hangar— rather unusable results. Well, I must say this is quite an impressive achievement your people have accomplished here, the Lord Admiral said as the shuttlecraft began to float away from the shipyard and return to the nearby station. I believe we shall be quite interested in— His words died in his throat. What is that? Alf groaned, seemingly frozen and unwilling to turn around as the human ambassador hissed, I thought I'd told you to close those bay doors? With the calm firmness of someone unwilling to take the blame for an ensuing shitstorm, Alf said, And I told you, Ambassador, it's too long to close the bay doors. You're the one who insisted we come all the way around to see the bug ship, even against my advice. And we can't stop the shipyard rotation, or else we lose what little artificial gravity we have until we get it spinning again. The ambassador let out a long-suffering sigh and turned back to the Lord Admiral, an appeasing smile on their face as they said, Well, this had intended to be a, shall we say, surprise gift for your people at a future date, but— The flagship. It's the third Queen's light between the dying stars. Jutting almost a full bay length out of the hangar bay again was a long, slender craft bristling with weapon batteries and a high degree of intricate filigree and decorations on all surfaces. The overall shape and lines of the craft vaguely resembled the shuttlecraft they were in now, and much more closely resembled those ships of the Lord Admiral's people, but of a much older and more decorative design. The ship had been thought lost, destroyed by the pull of a wormhole at the edge of a climactic battle against the upstart princess, nearly 3 millennia ago by their people's reckoning. Now here it appeared to be, glimmering intact and flawless in the bay. In fact, the degree of cleanliness and lack of any battle scars made Lord Admiral suspicious, and that transferred onto his expression as he turned to face the meekly guilty ambassador next to him. Tell me how this was done before I start a diplomatic incident. Well, as you well know, the light between the dying stars is highly depicted in images, drawings, and contexts in your people's records. We knew that there were some pieces of engineering aboard it that have still not yet been replicated, so we thought it might be worth attempting to build our best estimation of the assembly of the ship, in order to then study it and utilize whatever knowledge we glean for our own craft. The Lord Admiral stared out again. So it's a reproduction, and not the real thing? He said. Yes, Lord Admiral, said the ambassador with a low nod. We've got probes out, but of course they've shown no sign of anything coming out of the event horizon that the light between the dying stars was last seen in. The Lord Admiral let out a held breath, relieved that this was a different but less severe level of transgression than he had originally feared it was. Still, he said, this creation, this replica you've made, will likely have half of our people and scholars drooling over it and seeking to obtain a recreation for ourselves, and the other half seeking to have you beheaded and dismembered for such heresy. He sighed. I will think on it and determine the best way to broach the subject with my superiors and the Fourth Queen, to ensure that our relationship with humanity is not brought to a grinding halt because of this experiment, he said, doing his best to avoid spitting the word out. The human Mackenzie then let out a breath of relief of their own, clearly expecting the interaction to go even worse than it already had. That is extremely fair and reasonable, Lord Admiral, and my superiors will likewise be eager to discuss however we can ensure that all due respect is granted and given in whatever ways your queen desires. Arms crossed in front of his chest, the Lord Admiral flicked his mandibles. You said there's one more ship for me to see. Alf leaned forward to direct the controls of the shuttlecraft to the final bay in the shipyard. He keyed an audio channel. The cat's out of the bag regarding the dying stars, so go ahead and pop the hood on the collage class. Collage? I do not know this human word, said the Lord Admiral as the bay door slowly began opening. It's a human term for a type of art, said Mackenzie. The practice of making a new and inspiring piece using pieces of other art and media, something that's more than the sum of its parts. With that, I'd like to present to you the UNSS Amalgam. The ship that was now bathed in the light of the sun the shipyard orbited was a collection of pieces clearly, for it could be little else. The shape was a long, pointed craft, similar to the light between the dying stars at first glance, but with many of the gildings replaced with more functional and squared-off elements that he recognized from typical human designs. The shape also appeared to be offset, with a large circular cylindrical bulge beneath the full length of the prow. Towards the middle was a ring-like disc almost resembling horizontal semicircular wings on either side, and trailing off the back like a brilliant banner were a pair of ponderous purple antennae, slimmer than those seen on the bioship, but clearly derived from the same overall genetic stock. The full length of the ship contains an adaptation of a few-dried railgun that we managed to reduce somewhat, said Alf, clearly more comfortable with discussing ship specifications than navigating diplomatic minefields. The reduction in barrel length does mean some loss in accuracy, but as long as you're firing at something in the same solar system, you shouldn't notice anything different. We've incorporated the Nanette ring structure into the ship as well, reducing the complexities that arise from having an orbiting structure in lockstep with the cockpit. The power consumption of the railgun and the rest of the ship does mean that stealth isn't an option, but in exchange for losing that, you'll have more power than you possibly need. And a railgun can fire up to twice a minute, while the overall lines of the ship are of course derived from the dying stars. We also incorporated elements of the armor alloy that we figured out was used as well, giving it the durability to survive any direct hits that manage to overwhelm the shielding or bypass it altogether. He gestured to the back of the ship, with the gently waving trail of antenna, and of course you won't be able to be snuck up on thanks to the antenna array, and we're still working on trying to network them in a sort of hive communication network. As we've seen colony bioships manage to achieve faster-than-light communications without dumping the normal energy you would need into tunneling a hyperspace channel to do so. The Lord Admiral was stunned, staring at a ship that was both ugly and beautiful, and with capabilities the engineer had discussed that outstripped anything even in their experimental shipyards and design labs. I believe we will be strongly interested in acquiring some of these once you begin production, he said after a moment, but I do still hold concern that your use of the Third Queen's flagship may prove too much for some to see past. Well, sir, said the engineer with a reassuring smile, perhaps you could give them another human turn of phrase. For humanity, it's widely seen that imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. He stuck out a hand, and after a moment of hesitation, the Lord Admiral reached out and shook it.